Carthage, Missouri, 1932. The Depression had wrapped its bony fingers around the town like everything else in America. Main Street businesses closed one by one, their windows papered over with foreclosure notices that fluttered in the autumn wind. But Elizabeth Keller's seamstress shop remained, a stubborn holdout against economic ruin. At 52, Elizabeth had the advantage of being the only skilled seamstress within 30 miles. Her small storefront sat wedged between an empty hardware store and a struggling pharmacy. Inside, the golden light of oil lamps illuminated walls lined with fabrics, most faded and well-worn, brought in by townsfolk hoping she could breathe new life into old cloth. "Just a bit tighter around the waist, Mrs. Keller," said Judith Blackwood, the banker's wife who stood on Elizabeth's measuring platform. "Thomas says I've lost weight, though heaven knows how, with what little we have to eat these days." Elizabeth nodded, pins between her lips as her practiced fingers worked the fabric. She'd been altering the same 3 dresses for Judith for years now, each time making them smaller as the woman withered with age and worry. The bell above the door jingled. A tall man entered, hat in hand, his overcoat dusted with the grit of travel. Behind him, 2 porters struggled with an enormous steamer trunk, its leather weathered and scarred from countless journeys. "Mr. Davenport," Elizabeth said, recognizing the railroad executive who occasionally passed through Carthage. "I wasn't expecting you until next week." "Change of plans, Mrs. Keller," he replied, his voice carrying the refined tone of East Coast education. "I'm heading to San Francisco tomorrow. Need to check on some investments." His eyes shifted nervously. "I was hoping you could store this trunk until I return." 2 weeks at most, Elizabeth frowned. "I'm not a storage facility, Mr. Davenport." He slipped a hand into his pocket and withdrew a small stack of bills. $50 for your trouble. $50. That would cover her rent for 3 months. Elizabeth's hesitation lasted only a moment. "In the back room, gentlemen," she directed the porters. After the trunk was positioned in her storage room and Judith Blackwood had departed, Elizabeth found herself alone with her sewing machine in the curious trunk. It was an expensive piece, brass fittings and fine leather, with the initials WD emblazoned on its side. Strange that such a wealthy man would need her humble shop for storage. As dusk settled over Carthage, Elizabeth worked late, finishing a mending job for the pastor's wife. The shop grew quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of her sewing machine. Then she heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable in the silence. A child's voice, muffled yet clear enough to make out words. "Please, God, help Mama find me." Elizabeth froze, needle suspended mid-stitch. The sound came again, undeniably from the storage room, from the direction of Davenport's trunk. She set down her work and moved cautiously toward the back room, heart pounding against her ribs. Outside, the last light of day drained from the sky and the wind picked up, rattling the shop sign. "Hello?" she called softly, standing at the storage room doorway. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. Then the barest whisper, "Help me." Elizabeth's hand trembled as she lit an oil lamp. The trunk loomed in the corner of the storage room, its brass latches gleaming in the flickering light. She approached it cautiously, setting the lamp on a nearby shelf. "Hello," she whispered again, pressing her ear against the trunk's leather surface. "Is someone in there?" For a long moment, nothing. Then a soft tapping from within, followed by a small voice. "Please, I can't breathe very well." Cold fear gripped Elizabeth. She tried the latches, but they were secured with a heavy padlock. "Hold on," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'll get you out." She rushed to her workbench, grabbing a hammer and a sturdy screwdriver. Back at the trunk, she wedged the screwdriver into the lock hasp and brought the hammer down hard. Once, twice, 3 times before the metal finally gave way with a sharp crack. Elizabeth's hands shook as she threw open the trunk's heavy lid. Inside, curled among neatly folded clothes and stacks of papers, was a boy no more than 7 years old. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear, body trembling. "Oh my God," Elizabeth gasped, reaching in to help him out. "Are you hurt?" The child flinched at her touch, but allowed her to lift him. He was light, too light, and his clothes hung loosely on his small frame. Dark bruises circled his wrists. "What's your name?" she asked, guiding him to a chair in her main shop. "William," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "William Davenport." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. "Davenport?" said man. "Is he your father?" William nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "He gets mad when people ask about me. Says I make too much noise." His small fingers plucked at the frayed edges of his shirt sleeves. "Where's my mama?" He said we were going to see her. Elizabeth brought him a glass of water, which he drank greedily. "When did you last eat, William?" "Yesterday, I think, before we got on the train." A surge of anger rose in Elizabeth. She had suspected Walter Davenport wasn't an entirely honest man. Rumors swirled about his business dealings, but this was beyond comprehension. "Wait here," she instructed, moving to her small kitchenette behind the shop. She returned with bread, cheese, and an apple, which William devoured as if he hadn't seen food in days. While he ate, Elizabeth paced the shop floor, considering her options. The sheriff was out of town until tomorrow. The police station was manned only by Deputy Collins, young and inexperienced. And Davenport was a powerful man with connections throughout the state. A sudden banging on the shop door made them both jump. Through the front window, Elizabeth could see Walter Davenport's tall figure, his face contorted with rage. "Mrs. Keller!" he shouted, pounding again. "I know you're in there. I need to retrieve something from my trunk." William dropped the apple, terror washing over his face. "Please don't let him take me," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders and moved William to the storage room. "Hide behind those fabric bolts," she instructed. "Don't make a sound." As the boy scurried to conceal himself, Elizabeth composed her features and approached the door. Outside, the night had fully descended, and Davenport's face was half hidden in shadow. "Mr. Davenport," she said evenly, opening the door just enough to address him. "I was about to retire for the evening. I apologize for the late hour," he replied, his tone falsely cordial. "I realized I packed some important documents I need for tomorrow. May I retrieve them?" "I'm afraid that's impossible," Elizabeth said, blocking his view into the shop. "There was an incident with water damage from a leaky roof. I've moved everything for safekeeping. Come back tomorrow and I'll have your trunk ready." Davenport's facade of politeness slipped, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "I need to access my property now, Mrs. Keller, and I need to protect my shop from unwanted intrusions after business hours," she replied, her heart hammering in her chest. "Good night, Mr. Davenport." Before he could protest further, she closed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the window, she watched as he stood there, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Finally, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of Main Street. Elizabeth leaned against the door, exhaling a shaky breath. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. Walter Davenport would return. And when he did, he wouldn't be alone. The night settled around Elizabeth's shop like a shroud. Rain began to fall, pattering against the windows and casting strange, elongated shadows across the wooden floors. William had fallen asleep on a makeshift bed of fabric scraps in the storage room, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Elizabeth sat in her rocking chair by the front window, a shotgun across her lap, a relic from her late husband, something she'd never imagined using. Her mind raced through possibilities. Walter Davenport wasn't a man who would simply walk away. He'd return, perhaps with the law on his side, spinning tales about a meddling seamstress who'd stolen his property. She needed a plan. And Elizabeth moved quietly to her desk and began to write. First a letter to Sheriff Blackwood detailing what she'd discovered. Then another to her sister in Kansas City, who worked as a nurse at the children's hospital there. If something happened to Elizabeth, someone needed to know about William. Around midnight, the bell above her shop door jangled violently. Elizabeth jerked awake, realizing she'd dozed off. Through the rain-streaked window, she could make out three figures, Davenport and two larger men she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Keller?" Davenport called, his voice carrying an edge of threatening politeness. "Final chance to do this civilly?" Elizabeth clutched the shotgun and stood. "The sheriff will be back tomorrow, Mr. Davenport. Any business can wait until then." "I'm afraid this can't wait," he replied. One of his companions stepped forward, a heavy tool in hand, and before Elizabeth could react, he smashed it against the door lock. She backed away as the men forced their way inside, rain and wind following them. Davenport's eyes found the shotgun in her hands, and his lips curled into a smirk. "Really, Mrs. Keller? You intend to shoot me over a misunderstanding?" "There's no misunderstanding about a child locked in a trunk," she said, raising the gun. Davenport sighed, glancing at his companions. "She's clearly unwell, gentlemen. My poor late sister's boy has that effect on people, tells fantastic stories for attention." His voice dropped to a confidential tone. "The doctor says it's a sickness of the mind. We're taking him to a specialist in California. He has bruises on his wrists," Elizabeth countered. "And he was locked in a trunk, Mr. Davenport, for his own protection during travel." Davenport said smoothly, "William has ... episodes. He harms himself and others. The restraints are unfortunate but necessary." One of the men at Elizabeth now recognized him as George Fletcher. A local who worked odd jobs around town shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should wait for the sheriff, Mr. Davenport." "Nonsense," Davenport snapped. "This woman has broken into my property and is harboring my disturbed nephew against medical advice. We're taking him now." Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger. "Get out of my shop." For a tense moment, no one moved. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. Then a small voice came from the storage room doorway. "You're not my uncle." All heads turned to see William standing there, his small frame dwarfed by the doorway. Despite his fear, his chin was raised defiantly. "You told me to call you father when people asked," the boy continued, his voice gaining strength. "You said if I didn't, you'd hurt Mama." Davenport's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged toward William. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space of the shop. Elizabeth had aimed at the ceiling, and plaster dust rained down on them all. The men froze. "The next one won't miss," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "George Fletcher, I've known you since you were younger than this boy. Do you really want to be party to kidnapping?" Fletcher looked from Davenport to William, then to Elizabeth. Doubt clouded his features. "Mr. Davenport said it was a family matter, ... He's not my family," William cried. "He took me from school. Said Mama was waiting at the train station, but she wasn't there." The second man, a stranger to Elizabeth, backed toward the door. "I didn't sign up for this, Davenport. You said it was just retrieving your nephew." "He's lying," Davenport shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "The boy is disturbed." But doubt had taken root. Fletcher stepped away from Davenport. "I think we should wait for Sheriff Blackwood." Davenport's hand darted inside his coat and emerged with a pistol. "I'm taking the boy now." Elizabeth leveled the shotgun at his chest. "Not while I'm breathing." Outside, lights appeared on the street. A motor car pulling up, its headlamps cutting through the rainy night. The shop door opened again and Deputy Collins entered, water streaming from his hat brim. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Elizabeth never took her eyes off Davenport. "This man locked a child in a trunk and is attempting to kidnap him." "She's delusional," Davenport countered, keeping his pistol low by his side, partially concealed from the deputy's view. "The boy is my nephew. We're passing through town." Collins looked confused, his young face creased with uncertainty. "Mr. Davenport is a respected businessman, Mrs. Keller ... double quotes asked the boy," Elizabeth said firmly. All eyes turned to William, who stood trembling but resolute. "He hurt me," the child said simply, pulling up his sleeve to show the bruises. "And he's not my uncle or my father. My father died last year. Mr. Davenport worked with him at the bank in Chicago." Something shifted in Deputy Collins's expression. He turned to Davenport, his hand moving to his own sidearm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station until we sort this out." Davenport's face went blank, a dangerous stillness coming over him. His grip tightened on his hidden pistol. Elizabeth saw it happening before anyone else. The slight tensing of his shoulders, the hardening of his eyes. "Gun," she shouted as Davenport raised his weapon toward the deputy. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. For a moment that stretched like eternity, no one moved. Then Walter Davenport crumpled to the floor, a red stain spreading across his chest. Deputy Collins stood with his service revolver still extended, his young face pale with shock. "Dear Lord," he whispered. Elizabeth lowered her shotgun and rushed to shield William's eyes from the sight. The boy buried his face against her skirt, his small body shaking with silent sobs. George Collins addressed Fletcher, his voice steadying. "Get Doc Morris, and find Reverend Simmons. We need him here too." Fletcher nodded and hurried out into the rain. The other man, the stranger, had backed himself against the wall, his hands raised. "I didn't know," he stammered. "He paid me to help move a trunk. Said his nephew was troublesome. I swear I didn't know there was a child inside." Collins motioned with his gun. "Sit down over there. Don't move until I figure out what to do with you." Elizabeth guided William to her rocking chair away from Davenport's body. "It's over now," she soothed, though her own hands were shaking. "You're safe." The boy looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Is he dead?" Elizabeth glanced at Davenport's motionless form. "Yes," she said simply. There was no use shielding the boy from that truth. He'd seen enough horrors already. "What about my mama?" William asked, his voice small. Elizabeth exchanged looks with Collins. The deputy holstered his weapon and knelt before the boy. "William, can you tell me your mama's name and where you live?" "Catherine Davenport," he replied. "We live in Chicago on Briarwood Avenue." "Number 1478, Collins nodded. "We'll send a telegram first thing in the morning. We'll find her." Within the hour, Elizabeth's small shop had become the center of a storm. Doc Morris confirmed what they already knew. Walter Davenport was dead. Reverend Simmons arrived with his wife, who took one look at William and insisted on bringing him to the parsonage for a proper meal and bed. "You'll stay with us tonight, young man," Mrs. Simmons said kindly. My son's old room is all made up, and I believe his pajamas might just fit you. Elizabeth watched as the Reverend's wife led William away, the boy glancing back at her with uncertainty. "I'll be right here in the morning," Elizabeth assured him. "Get some rest." After they departed, Sheriff Blackwood arrived, having been fetched from his sister's farm outside town. He took statements from everyone present, his weathered face grave as the story unfolded. "This is an ugly business," he said finally, closing his notebook. "But from what I can gather, you had no choice, Collins. And you, Mrs. Keller, you likely saved that boy's life. What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, looking around her shop. Blood stained the floorboards where Davenport had fallen, and the trunk still sat open in her back room, a grim reminder of what had transpired. "Now we wait for morning and send that telegram to Chicago," Blackwood replied, "and pray that the boy's mother is indeed where he says she is." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. The adrenaline that had sustained her was ebbing, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its wake. Sheriff Blackwood seemed to notice. "You should get some rest, Mrs. Keller. We've secured your shop as best we can. Collins will stand watch tonight," but sleep proved elusive. Elizabeth lay in her small apartment above the shop, listening to the rain and the occasional footsteps of Deputy Collins patrolling below. Her mind kept returning to William, his pale face, his quiet courage in standing up to Davenport. What kind of man would lock a child in a trunk? And for what purpose was he transporting him across the country? Morning brought weak sunshine and a telegram from Chicago. Elizabeth was at the sheriff's office when the reply arrived, having spent dawn hours cleaning her shop of the previous night's violence. Sheriff Blackwood's face brightened as he read the message. "Catherine Davenport is alive and well," he announced. "She reported her son missing 3 days ago. According to Chicago police, Walter Davenport was her late husband's business partner and executor of his estate. There have been ... questions about his management of the Davenport finances. He was stealing from them," Elizabeth said. "It wasn't a question. Appears so. And when Mrs. Davenport began asking too many questions ... double quotes, he took her son," Elizabeth finished, "to control her." The sheriff nodded grimly. "She's catching the next train to Carthage. Should arrive tomorrow afternoon." Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Does William know?" "Reverend Simmons is telling him now." The news spread quickly through Carthage. By midday, Elizabeth had received 3 different casseroles from town women, delivered with equal parts sympathy and thinly veiled curiosity. The sheriff had taken Davenport's body to the funeral home, and his accomplices were locked in the town jail, awaiting charges. Elizabeth spent the day putting her shop back in order, scrubbing the floorboards until her hands were raw, as if she could erase all evidence of what had occurred. Around 4 o'clock, a small knock at her door announced William's arrival, accompanied by Mrs. Simmons. "He wanted to see you," the Reverend's wife explained. William stood awkwardly in the doorway, dressed in clean clothes that were slightly too big for him. "Sheriff Blackwood says my mama is coming tomorrow," he said. Elizabeth smiled. "Yes, she is. You'll be home before you know it." The boy nodded, his eyes traveling to the spot where Davenport had fallen. "He said she was dead. That's why I had to go with him." Elizabeth's heart ached. She knelt before him, taking his small hands in hers. "He lied about many things, William. But your mother is very much alive, and she's been looking for you. She never stopped looking." Something in the boy's expression eased. He looked at her with solemn eyes that had seen too much for his young age. "Thank you for finding me in the trunk." Elizabeth swallowed past the lump in her throat. "You found yourself, William. You were brave enough to call out for help." That evening, Elizabeth joined the Simmons family for dinner. William ate heartily, some color returning to his cheeks. Afterward, while Mrs. Simmons cleared the dishes, he sat beside Elizabeth on the porch swing, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. "Will I have to talk about what happened?" he asked quietly. "To policemen and such?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Perhaps, but only to help make sure that Mr. Davenport's friends can't hurt anyone else." William nodded thoughtfully. "I can do that." He was silent for a moment, then added, "I prayed every night in that trunk. I thought no one heard me." "Someone did," Elizabeth replied softly. The Carthage train station bustled with unusual activity for a Wednesday afternoon. Word had spread about Williams's rescue and his mother's imminent arrival, drawing a small crowd of onlookers. Elizabeth stood on the platform with William, who wore his best clothes, hastily altered by Elizabeth's skilled hands that morning. The boy fidgeted nervously, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the train would appear. "What if she looks different?" he whispered to Elizabeth. "It's been so long." "She'll be the same," Elizabeth assured him. Though 3 days could indeed change a person, especially a mother searching for her child. And even if she looks tired or worried, her love for you hasn't changed one bit. Sheriff Blackwood maintained a respectful distance, his presence both official and protective. Beside him stood Deputy Collins, still looking shaken from the previous night's events, but standing tall in his uniform. A plume of smoke appeared in the distance, and the ground began to vibrate with the approaching train. William's grip on Elizabeth's hand tightened. "She's coming," he breathed. The locomotive roared into the station, steam billowing across the platform as it screeched to a halt. Passengers began disembarking, traveling salesmen, a few families, a young couple. And then, emerging from the third car, a woman in a navy blue traveling suit, her blonde hair tucked beneath a modest hat. Her eyes scanned the platform frantically until they locked on William. For a moment she froze, one hand flying to her mouth. Then she was running, heedless of propriety, her hat falling away as she rushed toward her son. "William," she cried, her voice breaking. The boy broke free from Elizabeth's grasp and raced toward his mother. They collided in the middle of the platform, Catherine Davenport dropping to her knees to gather her son in her arms, both of them sobbing openly. Elizabeth watched, tears blurring her own vision. Around them, even the most stoic townsfolk dabbed at their eyes or looked away to compose themselves. After a long moment, Catherine rose, keeping one arm firmly around William's shoulders as if afraid he might disappear again. She approached Elizabeth, her face tear-streaked but radiant with joy and gratitude. "Mrs. Keller?" she asked. Elizabeth nodded. Without warning, Catherine embraced her. "Thank you," she whispered fiercely. "Thank you for saving my son." Later, in the privacy of Elizabeth's shop, Catherine Davenport revealed the full story. Following her husband's unexpected death the previous year, Walter Davenport had taken control of the family's finances as executor of the estate. James trusted him completely, Catherine explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. William had fallen asleep on a small cot in the corner, exhaustion finally overtaking him. They'd been friends since childhood, business partners for 15 years. "When did you begin to suspect something was wrong?" Sheriff Blackwood asked. Catherine's expression hardened. "About 2 months ago. Bills weren't being paid, despite my having given Walter the money for them. The bank sent a notice about our mortgage being in arrears. When I confronted him, he claimed it was a clerical error." She shook her head bitterly. "I started investigating on my own. Found records indicating he'd been systematically draining the account's investments, liquidated, properties sold off, and that's when he took William," Elizabeth said. Catherine nodded, tears welling again. "I'd gone to meet with our family lawyer that morning. William was at school. When I returned home, I found a note saying Walter had taken him on an uncle's outing." Her voice broke. "By the time I realized something was truly wrong and contacted the police, they were long gone." "He was headed to San Francisco," Sheriff Blackwood noted, "likely planning to disappear entirely, perhaps abroad. With my son as leverage to keep me from pursuing him," Catherine finished, anger flashing in her eyes. "He knew the money meant nothing to me compared to William." Elizabeth thought of the trunk, of the small boy praying in the darkness. "He treated your son like luggage," she said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Catherine reached for Elizabeth's hand. "But you heard him. When no one else did, you heard him." The next morning brought more clarity and decisions to be made. The Chicago police had telegraphed confirmation of Catherine's story, along with the news that Walter Davenport had embezzled not only from the Davenport estate but from several other clients as well. His accomplices in Carthage, having realized the full extent of their involvement, were cooperating fully with authorities. "They'll face charges," Sheriff Blackwood informed Catherine and Elizabeth over breakfast at the town's small hotel, "but likely reduced ones given their assistance." Catherine nodded, more concerned with practical matters. "The morning train leaves at 11. I'd like to have William back home as soon as possible," of course, the sheriff agreed. "Though there will eventually be a need for statements, perhaps testimony." "We'll return when necessary," Catherine said firmly. "For now, my son needs stability and safety." Elizabeth felt a pang at the thought of their departure. In just 2 days, William had carved out a space in her heart. She would miss his solemn eyes and quiet resilience. As if reading her thoughts, Catherine turned to her. "Mrs. Keller, I can never repay what you've done. If you ever find yourself in Chicago, double quotes, I'd be delighted to visit," Elizabeth replied warmly. "And please call me Elizabeth." William emerged from his room then, looking rested and somehow taller than he had the day before. "Are we going home today, Mama?" he asked. Catherine smiled. "Yes, darling. But first I thought we might have breakfast with Mrs. Keller, and perhaps you could show me around Carthage a bit." The boy brightened. "Can we show her your shop?" he asked Elizabeth. "And where the Reverend lives? Mrs. Simmons makes the best pancakes." Elizabeth laughed. "I believe that can be arranged." They spent the morning walking through Carthage. William proudly pointing out landmarks as if he'd lived there all his life rather than just 3 tumultuous days. At the seamstress shop, Catherine insisted on paying Elizabeth generously for her alterations to William's clothes, as well as for a new dress she commissioned. "I'll need to return for fittings," she said with a meaningful look. "Perhaps in a month or so?" Elizabeth understood the subtext. This would not be their final goodbye. As 11 o'clock approached, they made their way to the train station. William had grown quiet again, and Elizabeth knelt to speak with him privately while Catherine purchased their tickets. "You were very brave," Elizabeth told him. "Not just in the trunk, but after. Standing up to that man took real courage." William nodded solemnly. "I was scared," he admitted. "But then I heard you outside, and I wasn't alone anymore." Elizabeth felt tears threatening again. "You're never truly alone, William. Remember that?" The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden button. "I found this in your sewing box," he said. "I was hoping. Could I keep it? To remember?" It was a simple wooden button, nothing special. Yet in that moment, it seemed the most precious gift Elizabeth could give. "Of course you can." The final goodbyes were exchanged, along with promises to write and visit. As William and his mother climbed aboard, the boy turned back one last time. "Thank you for hearing me," he called. Elizabeth raised her hand in farewell, watching as they found their seats by a window. As the train pulled away, William pressed his palm against the glass, the wooden button clutched in his fingers. Long after the train had disappeared, Elizabeth remained on the platform, thinking about trunks and prayers and the strange workings of fate that had brought a seamstress and a lost boy together in Carthage, Missouri. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived for Elizabeth. The envelope bore a Chicago postmark and elegant handwriting she recognized immediately as Catherine Davenport's. Inside was a formal invitation to visit for Thanksgiving, along with a more personal note. "Dear Elizabeth, William speaks of you daily. The nightmares have lessened, though they still come. When they do, he holds the wooden button you gave him and reminds himself that someone will always hear him. The doctors say he's recovering remarkably well, considering what he endured. I believe much of that is due to you and the kindness you showed him. Please say you'll join us for the holiday. Our home's large and often too quiet these days. It would bring us both immense joy to share it with you, even briefly." With deepest gratitude, Catherine Elizabeth traced her fingers over the words, smiling softly. The shop had been quiet since the events of that rainy night. The town's initial fascination had gradually faded, though she occasionally caught whispers when she walked down Main Street. "That's her, the seamstress who saved the boy in the trunk." The story had even made its way to newspapers as far as St. Louis and Kansas City. A reporter had come to interview her, but Elizabeth had politely declined. Some stories weren't meant for public consumption, especially when they involved a child's trauma. Walter Davenport had been buried in the Carthage cemetery, unclaimed by any family. Outside, autumn winds rustled through nearly bare trees and shopkeepers closed early against the growing chill. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost missed the soft knocking at her door. Glancing up, Elizabeth was surprised to see Deputy Collins standing awkwardly on her doorstep, hat in hand. "Deputy," she greeted him, opening the door. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I wanted to check on you." His accomplices had been sentenced to 1 year in the county jail, a lenient punishment, considering their involvement, but reflective of their cooperation and apparent ignorance of the full scope of Davenport's plans. Elizabeth set Catherine's letter aside and turned her attention to the brown paper package that had accompanied it. Inside was a length of the finest silk she had ever seen, midnight blue with subtle silver threading that caught the light as she unfolded it. A note was pinned to one corner: "For the dress you'll wear when you visit us." William picked the color. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the luxurious fabric, already envisioning the design. It had been years since she'd sewn something so fine for herself. That evening, as dusk settled over Carthage, Elizabeth sat at her sewing machine with the blue silk. The rhythmic clicking filled the shop as she worked, a comforting sound after so many years. "Make sure you're doing well after everything," Elizabeth smiled. The young deputy had visited several times since that night, each time with some transparent excuse. She suspected he was still processing his own role in the events, his first time firing his weapon in the line of duty. "I'm quite well, thank you. Would you care for some tea?" Collins accepted gratefully, and soon they were seated at Elizabeth's small kitchen table, steam rising from their cups. "I received a letter from Catherine Davenport today," Elizabeth told him. "She's invited me to Chicago for Thanksgiving." "That's wonderful news, Mrs. Keller. Will you go?" Elizabeth nodded. "I believe I will. She says William is healing well." Collins smiled, some tension leaving his shoulders. "I'm glad to hear it. That boy showed real grit." "Indeed he did," Elizabeth agreed. "And speaking of showing grit, Sheriff Blackwood tells me you're being considered for a permanent deputy position." The young man blushed. "Yes, ma'am. The sheriff says I handled myself well that night." "You saved lives," Elizabeth said simply. "Mine and William's at the very least." Collins stared into his tea. "I still see his face sometimes. The Bonport, I mean. When I close my eyes." Elizabeth reached across the table and patted his hand. "That may never fully go away, deputy. But remember why you did what you did. There's no shame in protecting the innocent." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the ticking of Elizabeth's wall clock the only sound. Finally, Collins set down his empty cup. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Keller, and the company. Any time, deputy. My door is always open to friends." After he left, Elizabeth returned to her sewing. The blue silk took shape under her skilled hands, transforming into something elegant yet practical for her journey north. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to William and the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. If she hadn't agreed to store that trunk, if she hadn't been working late that night, if she hadn't heard that small voice praying in the darkness. Elizabeth shivered, though the shop was warm. She thought of all the what-ifs, the narrow margins by which destinies could change. One decision, one moment of attention or inattention, could alter lives forever. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shop sign. Elizabeth paused her sewing to add another log to the stove, then glanced at the calendar hanging on her wall. 3 weeks until Thanksgiving, 3 weeks until she would see William again. She smiled at the thought and returned to the blue silk dress, fingers moving with renewed purpose. Life in Carthage would continue its quiet rhythm, but for Elizabeth Keller, something fundamental had changed. She had saved a child who might otherwise have been lost forever. And in doing so, she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been dormant since her husband's passing, a fierce protectiveness, a willingness to stand against evil regardless of the cost. The seamstress who had lived an unremarkable life for 52 years had found an unexpected courage within herself, sparked by a boy's prayer from inside a trunk. As midnight approached, Elizabeth finally set aside her sewing and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new alterations, the familiar pattern of her days. But now there was also anticipation for what lay ahead, a journey, a reunion, perhaps even a new chapter in her life. For the first time in years, Elizabeth Keller fell asleep not with resignation about another day of sameness, but with genuine curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. The Chicago skyline rose before Elizabeth like something from another world. Even in the grip of the Depression, the city maintained a grandeur that Carthage, Missouri could never imagine. Massive buildings stretched toward the gray November sky, and automobiles clogged the streets in numbers that made Elizabeth's head spin. She clutched her small suitcase tighter as she descended from the train, scanning the crowded platform for familiar faces. The journey had been long, 2 days of watching the landscape transform from the rolling hills of Missouri to the flat farmlands of Illinois, and finally to this metropolis on the edge of Lake Michigan. "Mrs. Keller." A high voice cut through the station noise, and Elizabeth turned to see William Davenport pushing through the crowd, his mother following close behind. The boy looked transformed. His cheeks had filled out, and his eyes sparkled with an excitement that had been absent in Carthage. He wore a smart wool coat and cap, looking every inch the son of a well-to-do Chicago family. William, Elizabeth greeted him warmly, setting down her case to embrace him. "My, how you've grown." It wasn't merely politeness. The boy did seem taller, as if unburdened by the weight he'd carried in that trunk. Catherine Davenport approached more sedately, but with no less warmth, embracing Elizabeth like an old friend. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You've made William's month. He's talked of nothing else since your letter arrived, confirming your visit." "I've been looking forward to it as well," Elizabeth replied honestly. She had, in fact, closed her shop for the week, an unprecedented decision that had raised eyebrows in Carthage. A sleek black automobile waited outside the station, complete with a uniformed driver who tipped his hat respectfully to Elizabeth as he took her luggage. "Your home is in the city?" Elizabeth asked as they settled into the plush leather seats. "Just north in Evanston," Catherine replied. "James, my husband, preferred to be away from the bustle of downtown. It's about a 30-minute drive, as they traveled through Chicago's busy streets. William pointed out landmarks with the enthusiasm of a tour guide, the Marshall Field's department store decorated. For the upcoming holiday, the imposing Chicago Board of Trade building, the expansive parks along the lakeshore. "And that's where Mama works now," he said, indicating an austere stone building with massive columns. "The Chicago Public Library," Catherine explained. "I've taken a position in their rare books department. It's not necessary financially. James left us well provided for, despite Walter's best efforts, but I find I need the occupation." Elizabeth nodded in understanding. Work was often as much about purpose as necessity. The Davenport home proved to be a handsome Tudor revival mansion set on generous grounds in a neighborhood of similar estates. Stone and half-timbering gave it a solid, permanent appearance, while leaded glass windows lent an air of refinement. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth remarked as the car pulled through wrought iron gates. "It's too big for just the two of us," Catherine said with a small smile. "But William loves the grounds, and I couldn't bear to uproot him again after everything." Inside, the house was warm and inviting despite its size. A fire crackled in the main hall's massive stone fireplace, and the scent of baking filled the air. A middle-aged woman emerged from what Elizabeth presumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mrs. Keller has arrived, Mrs. Monroe," Catherine announced. "This is our housekeeper. She's been with the family since before William was born." "Welcome to Chicago, Mrs. Keller," Mrs. Monroe said warmly. "Dinner will be served at 6. I've prepared the blue guest room, and there's hot water ready, should you wish to freshen up after your journey." William tugged at Elizabeth's hand. "Can I show you the house first?" "Please." With Catherine's indulgent nod, Elizabeth allowed herself to be led on a whirlwind tour from the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves to the conservatory filled with exotic plants, to William's room with its model trains and shelves of books. "And this is my special box," the boy said, opening an intricately carved wooden chest on his dresser. Inside, among various treasures that only a 7-year-old would value, sat the wooden button Elizabeth had given him. "I keep it here so it's always safe." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm honored it means so much to you." That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining room, though Catherine had insisted on a smaller table being brought in to make the setting more intimate. The conversation flowed easily, with William dominating much of it, eager to share every detail of his life since returning to Chicago. Later, when William had been ushered to bed, Catherine and Elizabeth retired to the library with glasses of sherry. "He seems remarkably well," Elizabeth observed. "After what he endured," Catherine nodded, gazing into the fire. "Children are resilient, and he's had excellent care, a doctor who specializes in childhood trauma. Still, there are moments." Her voice trailed off. "Nightmares?" Elizabeth guessed. "Yes, and sometimes sudden panic when doors close too firmly, or when he can't immediately locate me." Catherine took a sip of her sherry. "The doctor says these reactions may fade with time, or they may simply become part of who he is. Either way, we'll manage." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. "I received a letter from the prosecutor last week," Catherine said finally. "Walter's associates in Chicago are being charged with conspiracy. Apparently, they've been siphoning funds from clients for years." "Will you need to testify?" Elizabeth asked. "Most likely, as will William eventually." Catherine's face hardened. "I would spare him that if I could, but the prosecutor says his testimony is crucial, especially regarding the trunk." Elizabeth thought of William on the witness stand, facing questions about the darkest moments of his young life. "He's stronger than he looks," she said softly. "But still, it won't be easy." "No," Catherine agreed. "Nothing about this has been easy." She set down her glass. "There's something I haven't told you, Elizabeth. Something I discovered after returning to Chicago." Elizabeth waited, sensing the gravity in Catherine's tone. "Walter wasn't acting alone in taking William," Catherine continued. "He had help from someone I trusted implicitly." She rose and moved to a desk in the corner, withdrawing a letter from a drawer. "This arrived 2 weeks ago from San Francisco." Elizabeth accepted the letter, noting the fine stationery and elegant handwriting that reminded her of Catherine's own. "My sister-in-law, Elise," Catherine explained. "James's sister. She was like a mother to me after my own past. When James died, she moved in with us for a time to help with William." Her voice broke slightly. "She and Walter were ... involved, it seems. Had been for years, even during James's life." Elizabeth scanned the letter, her heart sinking as she read Elise Davenport's cold words, her confession of helping plan William's abduction, her justification that Catherine was an unfit mother who had married James for his money, her belief that she and Walter could provide a better life for William with the Davenport fortune. "She fled when she heard of Walter's death," Catherine said, The police are searching, but double quotes, she shrugged helplessly. She could be anywhere by now. Perhaps even abroad. Elizabeth folded the letter, her mind racing with implications. Does William know? No, Catherine said firmly. And I don't intend to tell him, not yet anyway. He loved his Aunt Elise. This betrayal would devastate him. And you? Elizabeth asked gently. How are you bearing it? Catherine smiled sadly. One day at a time. I've always considered myself a good judge of character, to have been so thoroughly deceived by not one but two people I trusted. She shook her head. It makes one question everything. Elizabeth thought of Carthage, of the people she'd known all her life. Could any of them harbor such secrets? Such capacity for betrayal? The notion was unsettling. Trust can be rebuilt, she offered. Different, perhaps, more cautious, but possible. I hope you're right, Catherine replied. For William's sake, if not my own. As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11, Catherine stood. We should get some rest. William has plans for us tomorrow, the Museum of Science and Industry, I believe. Elizabeth rose as well, but hesitated. Catherine, about Elise, will you be safe here, both of you? A flash of steel appeared in Catherine's eyes. I've taken precautions. The house has a new security system, and Mr. Jenkins, our driver, is a former police officer who now serves as something of a bodyguard as well. She smiled thinly. And I've taken up target practice at a local shooting range. I will never again be helpless while someone threatens my son. Elizabeth nodded. Sensing in Catherine a kindred spirit, a woman transformed by crisis into someone fiercer than she'd ever imagined becoming. Good night, then, Elizabeth said. And thank you for confiding in me. You saved William, Catherine replied simply. There is no one I trust more. The days in Chicago passed in a whirl of activity. True to his word, William guided Elizabeth through the Museum of Science and Industry. His enthusiasm for the exhibits, particularly the coal mine and the massive model railroad, proving infectious. They visited the Art Institute, where Elizabeth surprised both Catherine and William with her knowledge of the Impressionists, gleaned from books borrowed from Carthage's small library. On the third day, snow fell over the city, transforming the Davenport estate into a winter wonderland. William insisted on building a snowman, and Elizabeth found herself drafted into service, packing snow into perfect spheres despite her protesting fingers. You've never built a snowman before? William asked, astonished when Elizabeth admitted it had been decades. Carthage gets snow, she explained, but I'm usually too busy with work to play in it. William's face grew serious. Everyone should play sometimes, Mrs. Keller, even grown-ups. That evening, as they warmed themselves by the library fire, a telephone call came for Catherine. She excused herself to take it in the study, returning several minutes later with a troubled expression. Is everything all right? Elizabeth asked. Catherine glanced at William, who was absorbed in a book across the room. That was Detective Harrison, she said quietly. They've located Elise. Elizabeth set down her embroidery. Where? New York. She was attempting to book passage to Europe. Catherine twisted her wedding ring nervously. They're bringing her back to Chicago to face charges. That's good news, isn't it? Elizabeth asked, noting Catherine's continued unease. Yes, but they found something in her possession. Letters between her and Walter. They detail everything, their affair, their plans for William, even double quotes. She lowered her voice further. Even discussions about arranging an accident for me once they had William safely away. Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. They meant to kill you. Catherine nodded, her face pale. Apparently Walter's death spoiled a much larger plan. Detective Harrison wants me to come to the station tomorrow to review the evidence. Of course, Elizabeth said. I'm happy to stay with William. Actually, Catherine hesitated. I was hoping you might accompany me. Mrs. Monroe can watch William and I could use the support. Elizabeth squeezed her hand. Of course I'll come. The Chicago Police Headquarters was a formidable building of gray stone that seemed to exude authority. Inside, Detective Harrison, a heavy-set man with a perpetually furrowed brow, greeted them in a small, cluttered office. Mrs. Davenport, Mrs. Keller, he nodded to each. Thank you for coming. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I should warn you. The contents of these letters are distressing. I understand, Catherine said, her voice steady. But I need to know the truth. The letters were arranged chronologically in a folder, which Harrison slid across his desk. The earliest dated back 3 years, while James Davenport was still alive. Elizabeth felt a surge of anger as she read Elisa's flowing script, detailing her affair with Walter and their growing resentment of James's wealth. He doesn't deserve it, one letter read. Always so cautious, so conservative with investments. I think what we could do with the Davenport fortune, Walter, the life we could have. The letters grew more sinister after James's death. when it became clear that his will had strict provisions protecting Catherine's and William's interests. Walter could manage the money but never control it outright. Only William, upon reaching adulthood, would have full access to the family fortune. "The boy is the key," Elise had written. "Once we have him, Catherine will sign whatever we put in front of her. And if not, ... double quotes, the implication hung unfinished. The final letters outlined their plan. Walter would take William, claiming a day trip. Elise would create an alibi for herself in Chicago, then join them later in California. From there, they would control Catherine through her son while systematically draining the Davenport accounts. If Catherine became too troublesome, there were plans for a permanent solution. "She's my sister-in-law," Catherine whispered, setting down the last letter. "She held William as a baby. How could she... Ball quotes. Detective Harrison cleared his throat again. "Greed makes monsters of ordinary people, Mrs. Davenport. I've seen it time and again in this job." "And Elise?" Elizabeth asked. "She's confessed?" "To some of it," Harrison replied. "She claims she didn't know Walter planned to transport the boy in a trunk, that she believed they were simply taking him on an extended trip with or without his mother's permission." Given the contents of these letters, however, quotes, he shrugged. "The prosecutor believes we have enough to charge her as a full conspirator in the kidnapping. And the murder plot?" Catherine asked quietly. Harrison's expression hardened. "That too. Planning a murder, even one that never occurs, is still a serious crime." They left the police station an hour later, both subdued by what they'd learned. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes settling on their coats and hats as they waited for Mr. Jenkins to bring the car around. "I knew Walter was capable of cruelty," Catherine said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "But Elise, I never suspected. Not once." "Some people hide their true nature well," Elizabeth replied, thinking of Walter Davenport's smooth manner when he'd brought the trunk to her shop. "That's what frightens me," Catherine admitted. "How can I ever trust my judgment again? How can I protect William from people like that?" Elizabeth considered this as they climbed into the waiting car. "Perhaps you can't, not completely," she said finally. "But you can teach him to trust his own instincts. From what you've told me, William sensed something wrong about Walter long before you did." Catherine nodded slowly. "He never liked being alone with him. I thought it was just because Walter was stern, not particularly good with children." She sighed. "I should have listened to my son." "And now you will," Elizabeth said simply. That night, Catherine broke the news to William that his Aunt Elise had been involved in his kidnapping. She did so gently, sitting beside him on his bed with Elizabeth present for moral support. "But why?" William asked. His young face crumpled in confusion. "Aunt Elise loved me. She told me so." "I believe she did love you, in her way," Catherine said carefully. "But she and Walter wanted something else, more money, power. They made very bad choices." William was quiet for a long time, processing this betrayal from someone he'd trusted implicitly. Finally, he looked up at his mother. "Is she going to jail? Like the men in Carthage?" "Yes," Catherine replied. "For a long time." William nodded solemnly. "Good." Then in a smaller voice, "Can Mrs. Keller stay longer? I don't want her to go home yet." Catherine glanced at Elizabeth, a question in her eyes. "I had planned to return to Carthage after Thanksgiving," Elizabeth said gently. "The shop, please," William pleaded. "Just a little longer. You could teach me to sew. I want to learn." Elizabeth smiled, despite herself. "A boy who wants to sew. That's unusual." "I'm not afraid of being unusual," William declared. "Not anymore." How could she refuse such courage? "I suppose the shop can wait a bit longer," Elizabeth conceded. "If your mother doesn't mind the imposition." "It's no imposition," Catherine assured her. "In fact, double quotes," she hesitated, then continued. "I've been meaning to discuss something with you. A proposition of sorts." Later, after William had fallen asleep, Catherine elaborated in the library. "I've been thinking about your shop in Carthage," she began, "and about how much William has come to rely on your presence." Elizabeth listened, curious. "What would you think about a partnership?" Catherine continued. "I've inherited several properties from James, including a small building on Michigan Avenue. It previously housed a milliner's shop, but it's been vacant since last spring." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "You could open a dress shop here in Chicago. I'd provide the space and initial investment. You'd provide your considerable talent." Elizabeth blinked, stunned by the offer. "Catherine, you don't have to answer immediately," Catherine hurried on. "Take some time to consider. But I believe you could build something remarkable here. Your alterations to my clothes alone have drawn compliments from every lady in my social circle." Elizabeth's mind raced with possibilities. Chicago was a world away from Carthage, bigger, faster, more demanding, but also filled with opportunities she'd never have in her small Missouri town. And selfishly, Catherine added softly, it would mean having you close by. For both William and myself. I'll need to think about it, Elizabeth said, though already she felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. Carthage has been my home for 30 years. Of course, Catherine nodded. No rush. But as Thanksgiving approached and the Davenport home filled with preparations, Mrs. Monroe baking pies, Catherine arranging flowers, William creating handmade place cards under Elizabeth's guidance, the idea took root in Elizabeth's imagination. A new beginning. A chance to build something larger than her small alterations business. And a continued connection to William, who had become so dear to her in such a short time. On Thanksgiving morning, Elizabeth rose early and found Catherine already awake, sipping coffee in the breakfast nook as dawn broke over the snow-covered garden. I've been thinking about your offer, Elizabeth said, pouring herself a cup from the silver pot. Catherine set down her cup, eyes hopeful. And I'd like to accept, Elizabeth replied, with one condition. Name it. Elizabeth smiled. I want to bring Deputy Collins from Carthage as security for the shop. The young man deserves a chance at something better than a small-town deputy position, and after everything that happened, I trust him implicitly. Catherine laughed, surprised and delighted. Done. We'll make all the arrangements after the holiday. Later that day, as they gathered around the dining table, Catherine at one end, Elizabeth at the other, William between them, and Mrs. Monroe joining them at Catherine's insistence, Elizabeth looked at their small, unconventional family and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had taken an unexpected turn that rainy night in Carthage when she'd heard a boy praying from inside a trunk. What had begun as a simple act of human decency had blossomed into something profound, a second chance for all of them. As William raised his glass of cider for a toast, his face alight with joy, Elizabeth knew she had made the right decision. Some journeys began in darkness, in fear and desperation, but with courage and compassion, they could end in light. To family, William said earnestly, the one we make ourselves. To family, Elizabeth and Catherine echoed, their glasses catching the late afternoon sun that streamed through the dining room windows. Outside, snow continued to fall over Chicago, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white, ready for new footprints, new paths, new beginnings. Spring arrived in Chicago with a riot of color. The bare trees that lined Michigan Avenue exploded with tender green leaves, and tulips pushed through the soil in carefully tended beds along the boulevard. 6 months had passed since Elizabeth Keller had moved from Carthage, Missouri, to the bustling metropolis, and still there were days when she marveled at the transition. Mrs. Keller? The Jameson order is ready for final fitting. Marie, Elizabeth's assistant, appeared in the doorway of the small office at the back of the shop. Elizabeth nodded, setting aside her ledger. Send her in, please. Keller Designs had opened in February, transforming the vacant storefront Catherine had offered into an elegant boutique. The interior, with its pale blue walls and crystal chandeliers, exuded a refined simplicity that appealed to Chicago's wealthy matrons seeking alternatives to department store offerings. To Elizabeth's surprise, her reputation had preceded her. An article in the Chicago Tribune about Williams's rescue had mentioned the skilled seamstress from Carthage, and Catherine had made sure her social circle knew the woman who had saved her son was now establishing a business in their city. Within weeks, Elizabeth had more orders than she could handle alone. Marie, a young woman with nimble fingers and a keen eye for detail, had been the first hire. Then came Thomas, a cutter whose experience in New York's garment district brought valuable expertise. Former Deputy Collins, now Mr. Collins, maintained security and managed deliveries with the same earnest dedication he'd shown in Carthage. As Elizabeth fitted Mrs. Jameson, the wife of a prominent attorney, for a spring ensemble, she reflected on how differently her life had unfolded from anything she could have imagined that night in her Carthage shop. You seem thoughtful today, Mrs. Keller, Mrs. Jameson observed as Elizabeth pinned a hem. Just appreciating how life can change in unexpected ways, Elizabeth replied with a small smile. After Mrs. Jameson departed, promising to return the following week for her completed garments, Elizabeth found Catherine waiting in the office, elegant as always in a mint green suit that Elizabeth had designed for her. I hope I'm not interrupting, Catherine said, rising to embrace her friend. Never, Elizabeth assured her. Is William with you at his piano lesson? I thought we might have lunch before picking him up. They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks from the shop, claiming a table near the window where spring sunshine warmed the white tablecloth. After ordering, Catherine reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. This came this morning, she said, passing it to Elizabeth, from the prosecutor's office. Elizabeth opened it, scanning the formal letter inside. The trial date is set. Catherine nodded. July 15th. Elise's attorneys have exhausted their delaying tactics, it seems. How's William handling the prospect? Catherine sighed. Better than I expected. Sessions with Dr. Merritt have helped enormously. He still has nightmares occasionally, but they're less frequent now. And his testimony? Elizabeth asked gently. The prosecutor has promised to limit his time on the stand as much as possible, Catherine replied, as Dr. Merritt will be there for support. She twisted her napkin nervously. I just hate that he has to relive it all again in front of strangers. Elizabeth reached across the table to still Catherine's fidgeting hands. He's stronger than you think, than any of us thought. Indeed, William had shown remarkable resilience over the past months. His initial clinginess with his mother had gradually eased, and he'd returned to school in January, quickly making friends and excelling in his studies. He'd even insisted on joining a youth baseball league this spring, something that would have been unthinkable in the immediate aftermath of his ordeal. Every Saturday without fail, he visited Elizabeth's shop, ostensibly to continue his sewing lessons, but more often ending up telling her elaborate stories about his week while she worked. The wooden button remained his talisman, kept in a special pocket sewn into each of his jackets at his insistence. You're right, of course, Catherine conceded. It's just difficult not to worry. Their conversation turned to lighter topics as their meal arrived: the upcoming summer fashion season, plans for the shop's expansion, William's upcoming birthday celebration. But the specter of the trial remained, a shadow at the edge of their hard-won happiness. That evening Elizabeth joined the Davenports for dinner, as she did most Fridays. William greeted her with an exuberant hug and immediately launched into a detailed account of his piano recital. Miss Abernathy says I have a good ear, he declared proudly, and I only missed 2 notes in the batch piece. Impressive, Elizabeth praised, hanging her coat in the entry hall. Perhaps you'll play for me after dinner? William nodded eagerly. At 8, he was taller than when she'd first met him, his face losing some of its childish roundness. But his eyes remained the same, solemn and thoughtful, with a depth no child should possess. During dinner, Catherine mentioned the trial date, carefully watching her son's reaction. July 15th, William repeated, setting down his fork. That's after my birthday. Yes, Catherine confirmed. About 3 weeks after. William was silent for a moment, then asked, Will Aunt Elise be there? In the same room? Yes, Catherine replied honestly. But she won't be able to speak to you or come near you. The boy nodded, processing this information. Good, he said finally. I want to see your face when I tell everyone what she and Mr. Davenport did. Elizabeth and Catherine exchanged concerned glances. William, Catherine began gently. The trial isn't about ... revenge, it's about justice. I know, William said, his expression serious beyond his years. But I want her to know that she didn't win, that I'm not afraid anymore. He looked directly at Elizabeth. Like you weren't afraid when Mr. Davenport came back to your shop that night. Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion at his words. I was afraid, she admitted. Very afraid. But sometimes we have to act bravely even when we're scared. That's what real courage is, William said with certainty. Dr. Merritt told me so. Later, after William had played his batch piece with only 1 missed note and been sent upstairs to prepare for bed, Catherine and Elizabeth sat in the library with glasses of brandy. I'm worried about his determination to confront Elise, Catherine confessed. There's an anger in him that wasn't there before. It's natural, Elizabeth replied. He was betrayed by someone he trusted completely. Still, I don't want bitterness to define him. Catherine swirled the amber liquid in her glass. I want him to heal, to move forward. Confronting her might be part of that healing, Elizabeth suggested, a way of reclaiming his power. They sat in companionable silence, the crackling fire and ticking clock the only sounds in the book-lined room. Finally, Catherine spoke again. The prosecutor says the case is strong. Between the letters, the testimony from Walter's associates, and William's account, Elise is likely facing 20 years or more. Good, Elizabeth said firmly. After what she planned for you both, she deserves every day of it, Catherine smiled faintly. The mild-mannered seamstress from Carthage has developed quite an edge. Elizabeth laughed softly. Perhaps it was always there, waiting for the right circumstances. As spring turned to summer, preparations for the trial intensified. William met several times with the prosecutor, practicing his testimony with remarkable composure. Elizabeth expanded her shop's hours to accommodate increased demand, hiring 2 more assistants. Life proceeded with a semblance of normality, though the impending court date loomed in all their minds. Then, 2 weeks before the trial, Catherine received another letter from the prosecutor's office. Elizabeth was present when it arrived, having joined the Davenports for a Sunday afternoon in their garden. Catherine's face paled as she read it. Elise is offering a deal, she said, her voice tight. She pled guilty to reduced charges if William doesn't have to testify. What kind of reduced charges? Elizabeth asked sharply. Accessory after the fact rather than full conspiracy, Catherine replied. The difference between 5 years and 20. William, who had been throwing a baseball against the garden wall, approached them, sensing the tension. Is it about the trial? He asked directly. Catherine hesitated, then handed him the letter. You're old enough to understand. Elizabeth watched as the boy read it, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at his mother. She wants me to stay quiet, he said, so she gets less time in jail. Yes, Catherine confirmed. But it's your decision, William. If you don't want to testify, no one will think less of you. William thought for a long moment, his young face serious. I want to testify, he said finally. I want to tell what happened. Are you certain? Elizabeth asked gently. It won't be easy. I'm certain, William said, his voice steady. Dr. Merritt says that telling my story is important, that keeping secrets can make you sick inside. He handed the letter back to his mother. I don't want to keep secrets anymore. Catherine pulled him into an embrace. Then you'll tell your story, and we'll be right there with you. That night, before returning to her apartment above the shop, Elizabeth found William in the garden, staring up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. Penny for your thoughts, she said, sitting beside him on the stone bench. I was thinking about that night in your shop, he replied. When I was in the trunk. Elizabeth waited, letting him gather his words. I was so scared, he continued. I thought no one would find me, but then you heard me. He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the first evening stars. Do you think that was just luck, or something else? Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. I believe there are moments when our lives intersect with others in ways we can't fully explain. Call it fate, providence, or simply human connection. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it. William nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. From his pocket, he withdrew the wooden button, turning it over in his small fingers. I'm going to have this with me. At the trial. A good talisman, Elizabeth agreed. Though you've always had the courage inside you. Not always, William admitted. But I'm learning. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, a firefly blinked nearby, then another. Soon the garden was alive with their gentle glow, nature's own stars brought down to earth. Look, William whispered, his face illuminated with wonder. Aren't they beautiful? Yes, Elizabeth agreed, watching the boy who had endured darkness and emerged still capable of joy, still able to see beauty in the world. Beautiful indeed. July 15, 1933 dawned hot and humid, the air hanging heavy over Chicago. Elizabeth woke early, selecting a navy blue suit that conveyed seriousness without ostentation. Today was not a day for fashion statements, but for supporting William as he faced his kidnapper's accomplice in court. The Davenport house was quiet when she arrived. The usual morning bustle subdued. Mrs. Monroe met her at the door, her normally cheerful face drawn with concern. They're in the library, she said softly. The boy hardly touched his breakfast. Elizabeth found Catherine and William sitting side by side on the leather sofa, already dressed for court. William wore a new suit that made him look older than his 8 years, his hair neatly combed, his face solemn. Good morning, Elizabeth greeted them, trying to inject normalcy into this most abnormal day. William managed a small smile. Mrs. Keller, you look like a judge in that outfit. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied, sitting across from them. How are you feeling? He shrugged. A childlike gesture that reminded Elizabeth of how young he truly was, despite his composure. Nervous, but ready. Catherine checked her watch. Mr. Jenkins will bring the car around in 20 minutes. The prosecutor wants us there early to review a few final points. The courthouse was imposing, a massive neoclassical structure with towering columns.